All right. So I'm not going to say any more about myself because that's uncomfortable. I am from Los Angeles, so I'm going to talk about the movies. How many of you have seen the movie 2001: The Space Odyssey? All right, fabulous. So that's about half. I'm going to give a very brief recap of the plot. So our protagonists are on board a spaceship bound for Jupiter. And the spaceship is beautiful. It's beautifully designed, and it's a masterpiece of technology. They can actually walk 360 degrees in this circle that you see here. There are doors in all 4 positions on the circle. The spaceship is run by a computer named HAL, and HAL is said to have a 0% margin of error. HAL is technically perfect. HAL is known to make completely flawless decisions and is also able to perceive, analyze, and respond to human gestures, emotions, body language, and interact socially with the crew as if it's one of them. But one day, of course, HAL appears to make a mistake. The humans start to worry about having HAL in charge. They share their concerns behind HAL's back, having what they think is a secret conversation. They talk about disabling HAL. But HAL is so clever, it turns out, unbeknownst to them, that HAL can read lips from a distance. HAL is eavesdropping and understands that they're about to terminate it. Although the humans thought that they were in charge of the machine, they quickly become aware that the computer can think for itself. Far from being within their control, as it turns out, it is in control of them. Am I there? Responding to a threat to its endurance, HAL does what is only rational. It terminates its relationship with its human companions. The Kubrick movie is a classic in a genre that explores our complicated feelings about science and technology. On the one hand, we expect technology to transport us to a place where all of our problems are solved. And on the other hand, we fear that technology will take us to a place where we're at the mercy of machines, where we're disconnected from reality and subject to forces that are beyond our control. So what does all of this have to do with the Museum of the Future? Our institutions tend to mirror the anxiety that I just described as we vacillate between the twin poles of hope and paranoia. We feel like technology is going to radically change how we work and how we engage with our audiences for the better, but we also worry that we'll be overwhelmed by technology that we can't control, or that it'll get in the way of the direct experience of precious art, objects, and artifacts. Within our own institutions, we often struggle to bring people together around technology-based projects. We find that some are enthusiastic, perhaps even wildly so, while others are frightened or threatened by new technology. And like the astronauts in the movie, they wish that they could just turn it off. So let me tell you about my job at LACMA. I oversee both the technology infrastructure for the museum and also its web and digital media projects. In 2012, we started an art and technology lab with input from companies including SpaceX, Hyundai, Google, and with their help, we give grants to artists who wish to engage with emerging technology to create experimental works of art. They get both financial support and in-kind support, often worth exponentially more than the financial support. The artists are under no obligation to collaborate with the companies. We just ask that the companies share freely the resources that they think would be useful to the artists in pursuit of their own ideas. The companies that support the Art and Technology Lab are the same ones that are investing billions of dollars in building the technology that will power the world in the not-too-distant future. So today, based on some input that I've had from them, I've put together for you what I think is a fairly realistic portrait of the Museum of the Future. Imagine maybe 20 years from now that the visitor is coming to your museum, and if they're in a city like Los Angeles, they very likely step outside and hop into a driverless car. As the car begins its journey, it alerts the museum systems who is about to arrive and exactly when. While the person makes their journey, the museum can deliver streaming video orienting them to what they're about to see. When the visitor arrives at the museum, a display welcomes them by name. They're charged the price of admission without ever having to take something as old-fashioned as a wallet out of their pocket. And the museum system keeps a complete record of every visit. Even with the visitor's permission, it may be able to sense the visitor's interests based on the games that they play, the shows that they watch, the news sources that they read, and other resources that they access on their personal device. An algorithm processes all of this information in an instant when the visitor arrives at the venue and tailors suggestions about what they might wish to see and do based on that data. When the visitor steps into the gallery, they enjoy the art on view unhindered by tiny museum labels that sit at the wrong perspective to enjoy the work of art. Instead, should the visitor wish to learn more, their personal technology knows exactly where they are standing, which way they are facing, and what they are looking at. It also knows their preferred language. The visitor has the option at any time to retrieve a wealth of information about the work of art. Let's say the visitor even wants to have a conversation with an expert about that work of art. In this case, they might enter into a conversation with a virtual curator. The virtual curator has been programmed by the museum's human curator. The human curator has told the virtual curator what cultural data resources to prioritize from a worldwide network. The human curator has been trained in editing algorithms so as to influence the virtual curator. Despite the virtual curator's breadth of knowledge, the conversation doesn't feel like talking to a computer. The virtual curator program is able to respond to the visitor's gestures, verbal and emotional cues, and respond in ways that feel natural. Not only does the visitor see the physical objects on display in the gallery, the museum has also used augmented reality to present virtual environments that contextualize the objects. In fact, the image that you see here is not an imaginative rendering. It's a real photograph of a visitor at LACMA using augmented reality to enter the environment of the famous film and photo exhibition that took place in Stuttgart in 1929. This was part of our Hans Richter exhibition. There was only one surviving documentary photograph of this 1929 installation designed by Elizitsky, but artists were able to recreate the environment for us in 3D. Augmented reality technology is getting ever better, and in the future, the visitor will be able to move seamlessly between the physical and virtual worlds, experiencing the past through their senses. While the visitor of the future is at the museum systems pick up data about where the visitor goes, how long they spend in each location, how fast or slow they walk, and what they do while they're there. By the time the visitor leaves the museum's database has stored a profile and uses that data to inform an aggregate picture of how people are using the venue. The building is informed by smart building technology and is able to make adjustments based on that data, perhaps to the temperature and humidity controls or redirecting resources such as janitorial services. Some of the things that I just described are actually already happening. In fact, some of them are happening in your museums and in mine. And as you know, these technologies are not yet perfect. They can be awkward and sometimes they fail. But I don't think that's our problem today. That awkwardness is going to resolve itself. We're not very far at all from the museum that I just described. So what do we need to do to be ready for that future? And what does it mean for you as communicators? How is the art of being contemporary and the art of communicating in a contemporary way evolving in response to new technology? In my experience, and what I hear over and over from our technology partners, investing in organizational culture is the very most important thing that we can do to be ready for the museum of the 21st century. And communication professionals are naturally possessed of the skill set and disposition to lead organizational change. We're all trying to figure this out together. Right now, many museums are trying to create centers of innovation within the traditional structure of the museum. This is the Art and Technology Lab at LACMA, and until 2 years ago, it was a rather tired-looking environment that housed our research library. But today, it serves not only as our research library, but also as a version of sort of Apple Genius Bar within the museum. It's a drop-in space for staff to learn about new technology, often alongside artists. In fact, here's some of our staff in the public with Swiss artist Anina Roost. She's demonstrating a robot that she made in the Art and Technology Lab in partnership with one of our advisors from UC Berkeley. Other museums are experimenting in their own ways with innovation labs within their institutions. Carnegie Museum's just announced its Innovation Studio. There's Cooper Hewitt Labs. The Spark Lab at the National Museum of American History is an excellent example, and I know there are similar enterprises in Europe as well. These environments are fun, and they expand the museum's scope and audience in important ways. So we must be on the right track. The problem, however, with all of these efforts is that it puts innovation in a silo. Labs like this one segregate experimentation. This is a problem that's particularly acute in the museum world. If I look at the technology firms who support our artists at LACMA, I see something very different. I see a culture where innovation is at the very heart of the organization, where structures, incentives, rewards, and everyday ways of doing business have been adjusted to maximize inventiveness. In fact, it might be worth pointing out to you that Anina's project here is openly critical of the organizations that supported it. It is a data visualization project that shows the gross underrepresentation of women in both the technology world, including at some of the companies that support our lab, and also in the art world. And what I learned from working with these companies is that it's more important to them to have their engineers work alongside artists on experimental projects than it is for them to avoid public criticism. And I think that's an essential lesson for us. In the 1960s, a professor named Everett Rogers wrote a book about a theory he called Diffusion of Innovation. He made the excellent point that innovation itself is not enough. In order for innovation to take hold and lead to positive change, it has to be widely adopted via a social system. And that's where communication comes in. He said that there are 4 categories of people in any social system, and innovation must be absorbed at all 4 layers in order to take hold. There are the innovators at the far left, followed by the early adopters, then the early and late majority, and finally the laggards. An innovation center like a lab or an incubator within your museum typically gets you to the early adopter stage. But what happens when a project leaves the lab and we try to make it part of business as usual? We get stuck trying to climb the very steep hill from the early adopters to the full majority because we have not got the culture and communication plan to get past the experimental stage. This is where most of our technology initiatives die. We often encounter resistance and think that it's a matter of having the wrong personalities in our institution. Secretly, we think that we need people to change, or perhaps we need different people to enter our organization. And we know that it's a very hard thing to change people. In fact, Rogers made the point that you are always going to have people along a spectrum that looks like this one. You can't just weed out the laggards and get on with it. The solution, rather, is to fully invest in communication from the very beginning. And I hope that some of you will go back to your institution and will approach whoever's in charge of technology there, deep technology, not just the visitor-facing technology, but the infrastructure, things like databases. And we'll ask them, where is it that we have the potential to really make change in the organization? And when they tell you what's possible, that you'll offer to help them drive communication in the organization to get past the early adopter stage. And I guarantee they'll take you up on it, and I guarantee that their jaw will probably hit the table when you make the offer. Communication is what drives culture, and what I've learned from the companies who support our art and technology lab is just how seriously they take organizational culture. When we started the lab, I thought that these companies were participating because they wanted visibility for their brand. In fact, what they told me is that they want to align their top engineers and scientists with artists to do creative projects because they believe that goes to the heart of their culture. It fuels innovative and original thinking, exposes them to new ideas, and gives them room to try new things. Their approach looks like this. They practice strategies and tactics, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. They thrive on a deep, abiding, underlying culture that they've carefully crafted in order to get the best from their people. Culture, as you know, cannot be dictated and controlled from the top. It's something that flourishes when we create the right conditions and when we take communication within an organization seriously. Organizational culture involves a complex network of beliefs and ideas and personality traits that are expressed in everything from the physical appearance of the interiors where museum staff work to the way that we run meetings and write budgets. So today I want to convince you of 2 things. I want to convince you that to be ready for the technological future, what you must do within your organization is build a great internal culture. And number 2, that you as communication experts are in charge. Let me offer a metaphor. This is our research library, and it isn't a photo from 1985, although it appears to be. It was taken maybe 5 years ago. It was taken during the time that I've worked at this museum. An environment like this begets a particular feeling. To me, it suggests certain priorities: books, paper, silence. It calls up certain memories of grade school or perhaps of a public library in a small town. It communicates a culture that is stodgy, traditional, maybe warm, but not very glamorous and not very exciting. I hope that you don't have anything this ugly in your own museum. However, I think that within each of our organizations, there is some equivalent. There's something that is this sadly neglected. It may be the format of a particular recurring meeting, or it may be a budget routine or a performance review process. Whatever it is, I urge you to find it and change it. When we replaced the dark research library with the art and technology lab, we redirected the time of some of our staff who were doing jobs that had been defined decades ago to enliven it. The environment that we have there today suggests and communicates our true values. Here we have two artists who came from Korea to meet with Max Maxwell, who's the head of a project team at Google who works on machine learning. And today the library, as you see here, is a place for conversation, innovation, and art, things that are closely aligned with our core values, unlike the previous research library environment. Museums tend to have certain cultural traits in common. I did a casual survey of museum professionals, and I came up with a quick list of values that they feel are expressed in their institutions on the left. They include reverence for the past, hierarchies, an emphasis on traditional ways of thinking, tenure-based systems of promotion. When we discuss risk, it's often about managing risk. Museum jobs tend to be highly specialized, and our decision-making processes and our workflows tend to be quite bureaucratic. These traits are obviously poorly aligned with the traits of an organization that's building a culture that can sustain innovation. Such organizations express the values on the right. They change quickly, encourage curiosity and open-ended experimentation. They're stimulating environments, not just for the public, but also for the people who work within them. They promote talent, they purposefully chase risk, and they give power to cross-disciplinary teams and de-emphasize hierarchy. Museums exist to preserve and convey culture with a capital C, and that is very important work, and it's often very slow and very painstaking work. Culture is complex and nuanced with deep roots and many branches. And it's natural that in doing this work, we ourselves become somewhat slow and painstaking. But museums are living organisms that can and must change and grow at a much faster pace than the historic material that we study. We are involved in a critical examination of history, but we are not ourselves preserved in amber. We can get up any time and rearrange the chairs in the museum, so to speak. And to build the museum of the future, to master the art of being contemporary, we must develop an organizational capacity for innovation to keep pace with a world that's changing very rapidly in our lifetime. In a museum that lacks great culture, talented people are left out in the cold. There's a critical lack of trust, and the people who work there feel threatened by change. Lack of trust looks like this: mutual suspicion that leads to alienation. People talk behind the backs of leaders. Perhaps they don't like and don't use the tools that are provided to them, or they see the potential in a new way of doing things, but they don't know how to make it happen because the structure of their institution has changed very little over the decades. Such environments tend to apply technology in haphazard ways and with limited potential benefit. When a museum doesn't have a healthy culture of trust and cooperation, technology projects become like putting lipstick on a pig. And technology is a very expensive lipstick indeed. We apply technology innovation as a decorative layer on top of systems and relationships that can't sustain it. Consider a scenario that developed in my own museum. We knew that we could eliminate more than $30,000 a year in printing cost if we got visitors to use a digital membership card instead of a physical card that they carry in their wallet. But when we went to build the digital membership card, we encountered a lot of what's called dirty data. In other words, the database of visitor information was a mess. Finger pointing in such a situation is completely pointless. I guarantee that every one of you probably has a similar situation somewhere within your museum, where the museum began collecting data haphazardly in the early days of technology, not totally clear on how they might wish to use it in the future. And now to leverage that data, you need to do some hard work to undo the past, and that requires collaboration and joint decision-making. It's much easier to fix inevitable problems like this one when you have an environment where people understand the objective and share the burden, one characterized not by blame and over-specialization, but by teamwork and collaboration. The founder of Geek Squad once said this: "Advertising is a tax you pay on having an unremarkable culture." And of course, trust matters not only within the museum, it's also critical in the relationship that you have with the visitor. The founder of Geek Squad meant that if you build a strong internal culture, you will have a strong brand. And if you don't, you're going to work exponentially harder to create a positive image of your institution. So I ask you to consider today, what your museum might be paying as a tax on a consequence of areas where your internal culture is unremarkable. And to get you going, let me give you an example of where weak culture can lead to technical disaster and ruin. In today's world, the visitor entrusts you with a great deal of data. And there are those who will tell you that eventually that data is likely to be compromised in some way, that you'll be hacked, and that your visitor information will get out. So say that happens. You've done your best to prevent it, but if a company like Sony can't stop it from happening, then it's very likely that it's going to happen to one of us someday. And in such a situation, in an organization with a weak culture, the visitor-facing staff very likely doesn't have a good understanding of where the data is stored. They may not even know the names of the people who work in the technology department. They may have no idea who to call in this situation. When a visitor approaches them and suggests that their data has been misused, the visitor-facing staff has no idea what to do. They don't know what to watch out for, they're unable to act as an early warning system, and when they do finally reach the technical staff don't know what data the visitor-facing staff has been collecting, or what they're doing with it, or how it's processed. They don't know how to advise on secure solutions. When the inevitable happens in such a situation, everyone runs around blaming everyone else, and the museum is unprepared to speak with its patrons quickly and responsibly about what's happened. The consequence of this kind of dysfunction is a loss of reputation, and once it's lost, it's very hard to get back, as you know. Now let's talk about the alternative in a strong culture. In a strong culture, your staff is closely aligned. They've thought about what data they're asking the visitor to share and why, and where it's stored and how it's used. Everyone knows everyone else's name. Everyone on the front lines can answer questions when the visitor asks them about what data we're collecting and what we're doing with it. It's not just the technology and digital media staff who know the answer to this question. What's more, this team has a communication plan in advance for dealing with any compromise of that data. They can anticipate problems, they know what they're supposed to be watching for, they know who to call. They can communicate effectively with one another and with the public. They've built a culture of trust so that when they're in a difficult position, they can leverage that trust to address the mistake and move forward quickly. So my message is this: to get technology right and to operate in the technical future, to prepare to lead the museum of the 21st century, you must have two things that you need to start building right now. You need a strong culture that puts innovation at the center of its processes, and you need expert communicators who are the champions of internal change. I want to propose that the role of the communications professional in driving technology in museums is much, much broader than most museums permit. Too often, communication professionals are called in at the end to write a press release about a new technology project. If the communicator's role doesn't already, it should absolutely extend to the enormous project of guiding the shift from the values of a traditional institution on the left to the values that support innovation on the right. That isn't a top-down mandate. It means surveying, listening, revising, changing what we recognize and reward, and building long-lasting trust, which are things that all of you excel in. The work of building an innovative culture that can support the Museum of the Future is hard, and I can't write you a roadmap, of course, but you're all smart people, and one of the great things about conferences like this one is that it gives us time to step away from our institution and to see it more objectively for a moment. And so I want to encourage you to use this opportunity here in Istanbul to reflect on the culture within your museum, and to think honestly and without blame about where that culture may be old-fashioned, trapped in conventional ways of thinking that prevent people from coming together around new opportunities. It may start small. Perhaps there's a single meeting format that you can change, or a job description or two that you can revise. Perhaps there's a depressing environment you can overhaul to create a more comfortable, stimulating environment for your team. Perhaps there are things that your team does out of habit that you could stop doing, thus freeing up time and perhaps money to try something new. I'm sure that together we could think of hundreds of ways to drive culture change in each of our museums. So I've assembled just two resources, and I sent them out on Twitter earlier today under the hashtag Museum Culture and CTM 2015. They're both about how to drive organizational change in nonprofit organizations. And I encourage you to join the conversation, and I hope that you'll share your ideas and your models for building a better culture with all of us here together while we're in Istanbul. Thank you.